Hello, everyone. This is Michael Nolan, and I'd like to talk to you today about a topic that is perhaps a little bit off the normal, well-trod historical track, so to speak, and which tells us something about the Cold War and the nature of the Soviet regime. But it also serves to illuminate some of the peculiar characteristics of the current moment through which we're living, and which manifests itself not just in the United States, but also in Europe. And in addition to being directly related to the Soviet experience, there's also a very large German component, which is of some interest, again, in the original genesis of what I'm proposing here, and subsequently during the Cold War, in the Cold War's later stages, and the development of contemporary politics in many Western countries, and it touches on a number of rather sensitive issues. So this is a reflection of work I have been doing for about the past year and a half now, and it's coming close to completion. If I can track down a number of people to confirm some of my propositions here. So some of you may have heard elements of this before, bits and pieces, but this is beginning to become a more fully formed argument. So let's begin with a quote from Karl Marx from the mid-19th century. Marx is writing here about Napoleon III, the nephew of the original Napoleon, whereas Napoleon the Great, as he was sometimes called in France, was an outsized figure, a figure with a kind of glorious reputation. His nephew was a very different creature. Napoleon III was a politician in both the good and the bad sense of the term, and he's referred to as by Victor Hugo as Napoleon le Petit, the little Napoleon. So here's Marx writing, Hegel remarks somewhere that all great world historic facts and personages appear, so to speak, twice. He forgot to add the first time as tragedy, the second time as farce. So this is a rather interesting statement. Let's explore this a little bit and consider the circumstances in which this could have an application in the present day. What we're talking about here is a rather prominent personage in international politics who is quite enamored of the study of history. Now, he has a rather old-fashioned view of history. The way I sometimes describe this is that it's the men of light hue making big decisions school of interpretation. Now, this is an interpretation that doesn't really have much traction in the American Academy these days, for reasons that are quite obvious, I think. But just because your view of history happens to be a little retrograde doesn't mean you can learn things from it. Now, it might seem quite preposterous that a prominent statesman in our own time could actually read history and learn things from it. But I think that this is the case here, and we'll consider the background. Now, we've already suggested that the Cold War begins not in 1945, but in 1917 with the Russian Revolution. And that the alliance between the United States, the Soviet Union, and Great Britain, which is on the winning side in World War II, is a kind of truce, a kind of break in the Cold War. And the Cold War picks up again around 1945. and we'll consider the outcome of that, of course. But let's turn to the revolution of 1917 and its background. Now, every starting point is a little bit arbitrary, and every starting point has its own antecedents, it has its own background. So let's consider an important step in that direction from about a century or so earlier. And this comes from the work of the German military historian and theorist Karl von Clausewitz. Clausewitz here is writing about the Napoleonic campaign against Russia, which turned out to be a disaster. And he writes here that essentially Napoleon is pursuing a kind of traditional military track against Russia, but that's simply not going to be effective. And so here he notes, writing about Russia in 1812, such a country can only be subdued by its own weakness and by the effects of internal dissension. In order to strike these vulnerable points in its political existence, the country must be agitated to its very center. Now, Clausewitz's book on war is a rather dense Teutonic tome that sits on the shelves of a lot of academics, historians, political scientists, and the like, the present academic included. I've tried a number of times to wade through Clausewitz's book, but always ended up kind of putting it aside. But I think one thing we should point out here is that in the 19th century, a lot of German academics, people in government, and above all, people in the military, read Clausewitz and were very, very familiar with his arguments. And they noted this one. For much of the 19th century, there's a kind of an uneasy alliance between the governing elites in Imperial Germany and those corresponding elites in what I like to call the Tsarist Empire. They both represented autocratic urges, we might say. They represented a distrust of the modern political system that was emerging to one degree or another in both countries. And above all, they feared the rise of social democracy. But there's also a kind of mutual suspicion between Germany and Russia, and this becomes more problematic, especially after about 1890 or so, when more and more they find themselves on the opposite side of the divide of alliance systems that leads to the outbreak of World War I. So German policymakers, both military and civilian, have to start to think about what to do in the event of a possible war in which one of those powers facing Germany would be Russia. Russia is a very large country. How do you actually take on Russia in the event of a conflict and not suffer the same kind of downfall that Napoleon did back in 1812? So let's consider the circumstances. For much of the 19th century, Russia, in particular, the regime of the Tsar, appeared to be on relatively stable footing. Now, at times, there was a good deal of political turbulence in Russia, but the regime reveals that it is capable of reforming to a certain extent to take the edge off possible revolutionary upheaval, while maintaining an autocratic system of government under the Tsar. That reaches its endpoint in the early 20th century, when Russia is engaged in what starts to look like a relatively small war in the Far East, the Russo-Japanese War, but which turns into a catastrophic defeat for Russia. And it's in the midst of this war that a revolution breaks out at home, the revolution of 1905, which threatens to topple the Tsarist system itself. So defeat in war and revolutionary upheaval at home, occurring in close proximity to each other, reveals the vulnerability of the Tsarist regime. And the Germans are very quick to recognize the significance of this. This appears to be a vulnerability in the alliance system that Germany is facing. And after 1905, that alliance system includes Russia, Britain, and France. So that's a quite formidable array of powers. And the term that German policymakers used was encirclement. Germany was seemingly surrounded by hostile powers, and that presented Germany with an unfavorable status in the event of the outbreak of hostilities. Now, so there's a hint here of possible future action, but that really doesn't come into play for about another decade or so. Now, the Revolution of 1905 is notable for a number of things. For one thing, Russia becomes a constitutional monarchy. It has a parliament, the Duma, as it's called, and it raises the profile of a number of revolutionary parties, and among them is the Russian Social Democratic Party. And by 1905, that party is already split into two factions, the famous Mensheviks and Bolsheviks. And the Bolsheviks, of course, are under the leadership of Vladimir Ilyich Lenin. Now, Lenin doesn't play a very prominent role in 1905, but there are two other figures later associated with the Bolsheviks who do play a role inside Russia in 1905. One of them is Lev Trotsky. And Trotsky, who at this point is a young lawyer, he's only in his mid-20s, becomes a kind of unofficial spokesman for the so-called Petersburg Soviet, which is a council of representatives of the workers elected to this council. And he assumes tremendous prominence. And this really marks the beginning of his rise, and he later becomes the partner of Lenin in the Bolshevik seizure of power in 1917. But he has an associate, a somewhat older figure, and his name is Alexander Helfand. But just like Lenin and Trotsky are revolutionary aliases for Ulyanov and Bronstein, Helfand has his own alias. His name is Parvus. So Alexander Parvus is how he's generally referred to. And there's something of a joke here because Parvus is Latin for small, and Helfand is anything but a small man. He's actually a rather big guy. He makes an impression on people around him in a variety of different contexts. The word Helfand is actually the Yiddish word for elephant, which is kind of fitting. Helfand is born, Parvus, as we'll call him from now on, is born in the vicinity of Minsk in what is now Belarus. And he's about a decade or so older than Trotsky, but like Trotsky, he studies in the city of Odessa. He then goes abroad to Switzerland to acquire a doctorate in the study of political economy. And he's able to do this, but he rankles his mentors somewhat with his rather radical opinions. And for that reason, he's unable to pursue a career in academia. And so he becomes involved in the social democratic political scene in Central Europe at that time, in Switzerland, but particularly in Germany. And Germany had one of the largest social democratic parties in Europe. It had widespread political support. It was growing by leaps and bounds. And the relationship of Russian Social Democrats with the German Social Democratic Party is a somewhat fraught one. Even at that time, within German social democracy, there's a debate between reformist social democrats who believe that they can achieve their aims through the political system by acquiring majority status in the German parliament, and the more traditional revolutionary element. So Parvus is leaning somewhat more to the left, to the revolutionary side of things, and he becomes very much engaged in German social democracy as a revolutionary theorist. He is the progenitor, the creator of the theory of permanent revolution, which is often more associated with Trotsky, who takes it over and carries it into his own revolutionary theories. But Parvus is also the editor of a number of social democratic newspapers, beginning in the city of Dresden, which is of some importance. But Parvus's revolutionary ambitions turn out to be somewhat thwarted. He suffers a number of frustrating setbacks. He's a rather prickly figure. He gets into debates, arguments with a number of his social democratic colleagues. But above all, he gets involved in a rather unfortunate publishing venture, which gives him for the first time access to a certain amount of funds, which he frankly misuses. He falls into some disrepute. And so by about 1910 or so, he finds himself at loose ends. It appears that his avenue into the upward ranks of either the German or Russian Social Democrats is now blocked off. And so he does something rather interesting. He decides to head off for the wilds of southeastern Europe, and he ends up in what was still referred to by most Europeans at that time as Constantinople, the capital of the Ottoman Empire. So the year is around 1910. In Constantinople, the ruling clique at that time is known as the Young Turks. And they're a group of military officers who launch a revolution in 1908 that reestablishes a constitutional monarchy with the Sultan, the traditional ruler, serving as the monarch. But the day-to-day governance is directed by the Young Turks. And Helfant, who I should mention is a gifted linguist. He acquires quite a bewildering variety of languages in the course of his career, picks up Turkish, and he is able to establish himself as an advisor, an economic advisor to the Young Turk government. And in this capacity, he engages in a number of different trading enterprises, beginning, it appears, with the grain trade in the Black Sea, which is quite lucrative, and picking up as well in the armaments trade, which is very lucrative, and which involves him not just with the Ottoman government, but with a number of the Balkan Christian countries as well. So he's dealing with both sides in what eventually generates what's known as the Balkan Wars in 1912, 1913, which turned out to be kind of a setback for the Ottoman government. So this is where Parvus is located at the outbreak of World War I in 1914. And he sees an opportunity here to begin to exert influence on a much wider field of events, as we might say. And he's able to draw on his wide array of contacts throughout Central Europe. Parvus, by this point, really identifies very strongly with Germany and Austria. He speaks fluent German. He spent a good deal of time in Germany and Austria and Switzerland and the like. And having the ear of the Turkish government doesn't hurt. So he makes his way into the good graces of the German ambassador in Constantinople. And he tells him, he has a little proposal to make to him. Now, we have to consider the circumstances here. The Germans, the civilian and military leaders, hoped to bring about a rather rapid victory at the outset of World War I, and they failed to do that. So by late 1914, the Germans find themselves in a very difficult, unenviable position. They face that hostile coalition of Britain, France, and Russia, and they're cut off from outside sources of supply from much of the rest of the world, and time is not on their side. So they have to figure out a way of trying to disrupt this opposing coalition that they're facing. And this is the context for this rather startling encounter between Parvus and leaders of the German diplomatic establishment, the German government, and some military brass as well in January of 1915. The German ambassador in Constantinople essentially introduces him into this rather interesting circle, so to speak, and the meeting between them occurs in Berlin. And at that meeting, Parvus lays out a kind of vision, if you will, for striking at the root of the Tsarist regime, engaging in a program of, shall we say, working through the vulnerabilities of that regime and bringing about turmoil inside Russia and the potential for a separate peace between Germany and Russia that will break up this opposing alliance and give Germany an advantage. Now, this program and Parvus even presents a kind of memorandum in which he lists the various points of it, includes a number of elements. So, for example, appealing to the subject nationalities in the Russian Empire, which includes the Ukrainians, the Georgians, the Poles, and others, in order to stir up trouble for the Russian authorities in these various parts of the empire. It includes a number of other elements, disrupting confidence in the Russian currency. Now, to this end, they have to rely on rather traditional means, so the distribution of counterfeit currency and the like, which is rather limited in its effects. But above all, the primary point that Parvus is trying to sell here is the idea of support for revolutionary parties inside Russia, and in particular he focuses on the Bolsheviks, who he sees as the most focused, the most organized, and the most ruthless and effective under the leadership of Lenin. And so here it is, early 1915, and Parvus is raising this possibility of a kind of tacit alliance between the Germans and the Bolsheviks under Lenin's leadership. And the Germans are committed, to providing financial backing in quite considerable way to these efforts to bring about a propaganda campaign inside the Russian Empire that will sway large portions of the population against the Tsarist regime. But it's still relatively early on in the war, so it's a little uncertain which side has the advantage in 1915. So Parvus begins to put this plan into motion, revving up propaganda elements among the disaffected nationalities and the like. And he reaches out to Lenin. And Lenin, it turns out, makes something of a show of rejecting Parvus's suggestions. Now, Lenin at this point is in exile. He's in Zurich, in Switzerland. And that's something of a problem for Lenin because Switzerland is surrounded by powers that are fighting on one side or the other of the First World War. So France and Italy, which enters the war in the spring of 1915, are on the Allied side. Germany and Austria-Hungary are on the side of the Central Powers. So Lenin is effectively trapped in Switzerland. The French and the Italians know who he is, and they have no intention of allowing him to go back to Russia. And he's a Russian national, so if he tries to go through Germany or Austria-Hungary, he's probably going to be arrested. Even with this kind of tentative offering from Parvus, Lenin is deeply distrustful. He's worried that he might be tarred with the brush of association with the Germans should he try to return to Russia. And this, it turns out, is a justified fear. Now, this policy that the Germans are pursuing, and it's not just Parvus, there were a number of avenues that they were following about the same time. This policy of stirring up trouble within the realms of the opposing powers is referred to rather broadly as Revolutionierung. And it's a German word. What it means is open to interpretation. Now, we could call it revolutionization, but a more accurate term would be stirring up trouble by whatever means necessary as opportunities arise, based often on long-standing divisions, colonial discontent, and the like. So there are a number of different avenues of approach, and both sides in World War I are trying to pursue one form or another of this policy. So, one way of doing this, you could, if you're a German policymaker, you appeal to the Muslim subjects of the British and French colonial empires to rise up against their colonial overlords in a jihad, so to speak. And the Germans attempt this through the Ottoman Empire. The Ottomans enter the war in the fall of 1914 on the side of the Germans. It kind of falls flat. It doesn't really lead to anything. Likewise, the British and the French try to stir up the Arab provinces of the Ottoman Empire against their Ottoman rulers, with somewhat more success. It's a long, complicated story. We don't have to get into all of that. The Germans also appeal to Irish revolutionaries to rise up against Britain, which they actually do in 1916. So these are just some of the methods which the Germans attempt, with not a whole lot of success, frankly. So here's Parvus, which offering them an opportunity that looks kind of promising, and he has his supporters inside the German foreign policy establishment and in the German general staff. So Parvus sets up this very elaborate system of communication and trade between the two sides, and in particular between Germany and Russia. And he sets up headquarters in a number of Central European cities, but in particular in neutral territories. So in Switzerland, in Denmark, in Sweden, in places like Basel and Copenhagen and Stockholm, he sets up this kind of network, and it runs all the way through Sweden, down through Finland, which is part of the Russian Empire, but it is autonomous, and down to Petrograd, as it's now called by the Russians. Now, Petrograd and Berlin obviously find themselves on opposite sides of this conflict, but there's a kind of underground trade that develops, a smuggling trade, because both sides have things that the other side needs, and if you can set up this trade through intermediaries, then you are able to satisfy these needs, and often, as it happens, acquire a great deal of profit in the process of doing this. So Parvus, who's already actually quite wealthy, begins to acquire even more wealth by engaging in this trade, and he also uses this international route to distribute revolutionary propaganda inside the Russian Empire, and to funnel funds provided by the Germans into the Bolshevik Party. Now, this question of German gold is sometimes reduced to that as a kind of shorthand, as support for the Bolshevik Party was a ticklish one. Historians across the 20th century investigated it. For a number of reasons, quite a few historians were more positively inclined to Lenin and the Bolsheviks. They downplayed this. They considered the question to be just that, a question, because of the lack of documentary evidence. But it's quite clear from the actual documentation that a lot of the agreements were done by word of mouth. A lot of the delivery of funds was surreptitious. Both Parvus and the Germans, and later on Lenin as well, were very, very interested in having a kind of plausible deniability to this underground support, so to speak. But it seems quite clear that this was instrumental in the Bolshevik success. It paid for armaments to be brought into Petrograd. It paid for the purchase of Pravda, the party newspaper, which plays a crucial role in 1917. And the Bolsheviks, who were chronically short of funds, were suddenly able to find themselves flush with cash, so to speak. Even though Lenin kind of demonstrates, to his followers that he's skeptical about Parvus and his ambitions, and privately Lenin is always on the lookout for possible rivals, and he's a little leery of Parvus for this reason. Nevertheless, he maintains contact with Parvus through a variety of intermediaries. And we don't have to get into the names of all of them, but they have good relations with both Parvus and Lenin, and they're linked up with this network, this smuggling network, and some of them actually profit from it to a certain extent. So we have people here engaged for a variety of political agendas, shall we say. At first, in 1915, for much of 1916, it doesn't appear that Parvus's plan is bearing much fruit. It's useful to the Germans because, as I said, both sides are acquiring useful resources, manufactures, raw materials, and the like in this two-way trade. So the Germans are able to acquire raw materials that are needed for their war effort, while they're sending things like machine tools and condoms, believe it or not, to the Russians. hypodermic needles are in very, very short supply. Certain prescription drugs and the like are also needed by the Russians. So, this is the situation in early 1917 when revolution breaks out in Petrograd. Now, we refer to the Russian Revolution of 1917. There were actually two revolutions, the February Revolution, as it's called, which is something much closer to a spontaneous uprising that results in the overthrow of the Tsar. And a number of outside observers, most notably Parvus and Lenin, are very quick to recognize the opportunity that this opens up. So here we have the possibility for Parvus to put into play his grand plan, so to speak, after a number of setbacks. And the Germans are now very, very hopeful. It's a long shot, but they're very, very hopeful. If they can bring about a change in regime, they could put someone into power that is, that will bring about, certain results, certain goals that they have been pursuing for a long time. And by 1917, there's a good deal of war weariness on both sides in World War I. But they both suffered millions of dead and casualties and the like. So the time element is growing increasingly important here. The Germans are feeling a lot of pressure. So the Germans are already primed to this idea of perhaps assisting Lenin into power, so to speak, not just through providing funding, but by a kind of direct insertion, so to speak, into this revolutionary situation. So in which there's a good deal of political divisiveness among the various parties, but the Bolsheviks, it has to be said, are the most ruthless party, the ones who are willing to seize power, the ones who are willing to short-circuit the electoral system that emerges under the so-called provisional government in Russia in the spring of 1917. So this is the background to Lenin's return to Russia in April of 1917 by way of German territory and by way of that same route through Sweden and Finland, which has already been primed by Parvus. And so, Parvus essentially is acting in the background. The German Foreign Office, the German General Staff are quite interested. Now, there's another factor that has come into play by 1917, which is this. The Germans are aware to a certain extent, they don't know the details, but there are a number of secret treaties that are signed by the Allies with third powers that enable the entry of these countries into the war. So Italy in 1915, Romania in 1916, and the like. There's a problem here for the Allies. The Allies have this rather intense propaganda of that Britain and France representing democracy and freedom and the like against the, whatever you want to call it, the Huns, the Teutonic heel, what have you. The propaganda is a little outlandish at times. There's a little problem with this Allied claim of representing freedom and democracy, and that is the autocratic regime in Tsarist Russia. But the overthrow of the Tsar now seems to offer a possible extension, if you will, of this very positive propaganda image. But here you have on the side these secret treaties, and they're secret for a reason, because they contravene all of this idealistic rhetoric, with the reality of rather ugly horse trading. So Italy is guaranteed its share of the spoils in the event of an Allied victory, territory at the expense of Austria-Hungary. Likewise, Romania is given its pound of flesh, so to speak. This is not a very edifying spectacle. And if this secret information is made public, that would be very embarrassing to the Allied governments, who want to present a very positive face, not just to their own populations, but also to neutral powers, above all to the United States. And by early 1917, this is a crucial moment in the development of U.S. policy toward the war. So the Bolsheviks are able to negotiate with the Germans, with the backing of Parvus and others, for transit through Germany on what comes to be referred to as the sealed train. It wasn't really sealed. Essentially, they wanted to prevent the spread of revolutionary contagion, and we'll hear that again in another context in just a moment. In Germany by the Bolsheviks, but Lenin travels across Germany, and there was no secret to this. He can't conceal this fact, and passes through Stockholm into Finland and arrives in Petrograd in April of 1917, and he immediately galvanizes the Bolsheviks, who've been following a rather moderate policy up until this point, to prepare for a seizure of power. Now, we don't have to get into all the ins and outs of the revolution of 1917, but suffice to say that the Bolsheviks play their cards very skillfully. And in spite of the fact that the Russian Bolsheviks are a Marxist party and preach the doctrine of a kind of historical determinism, that historical developments are patterned by the economic relations of the country in question, who owns the means of production, what have you. It's pretty clear in retrospect that the Bolsheviks would not have been able to achieve power without Lenin at the helm, so to speak. Lenin is very, very focused. Above all, his opponents are divided, and in particular the other revolutionary parties, his rivals, the Mensheviks, the Socialist Revolutionaries, who are predominantly a peasant party, underestimate the Bolsheviks. They have much more electoral support. They believe that elections will determine the outcome of the revolution in 1917. They fail to take into account that a minority group might beat them to it in one way or another, and that is what the Bolsheviks do. So essentially the Bolsheviks are able to put themselves into power, and the Bolsheviks have run on a program that includes ending the war one way or another. Now, actually doing that turns out to be rather more prickly process than they anticipated. But the Bolsheviks have been carrying on a campaign to undermine morale in the Russian army, and this accelerates in 1917. And so the Bolsheviks are able to bring about a kind of, even before their seizure of power, a gradual dissolution of the fighting effectiveness of the Russian army. So let's consider here what has happened what is continuing to happen in late 1917 and early 1918. the Germans seem to have achieved their primary aims, interestingly enough, through the help of a number of intermediaries, so to speak. So what they've done here is well, let's sum up. The Germans had succeeded with the help of a handful of intermediaries to an extent beyond their wildest dreams. They had inserted their preferred candidate for supreme power into the leadership of an enemy state, in spite of long-shot odds. They had contributed to stirring up existing ethnic, regional, and political divisions in the opposing power to a fever pitch. They had cultivated discontent with the fragile trappings of liberal democracy. The other parties in the Duma, in the provisional government. The military was riven by collapsing morale and deep divisions between the commanders and government leadership. The adversaries' economy and financial system were descending into chaos. Sensitive documents detrimental to the cause of their opponents had been brought into public view. Above all, the Germans had disrupted the powerful alliance opposing them and opened a potential road to victory. Their opponent, in short, was agitated to the very core. Winston Churchill, writing about the First World War and Lenin's return to Russia, described this as essentially Lenin being brought back, transported into Russia like the plague bacillus, and the infection takes root. The Bolsheviks now face a very, very difficult position themselves. They're tainted by their association with the Germans. This whole story, this whole factual relationship, becomes a kind of non-story. It's subjected to historical forgetfulness under the Soviet regime. It's only decades later that a number of historians begin studying this again, because Lenin was the hero of the revolution. To taint him with association with the Germans seems somehow, almost sacrilegious. Parvus, by the way, expected to be rewarded for his services. He assumed that he would be allowed back into Russia, especially after the Bolsheviks seized power, but they refused to let him come back. And he became very embittered. He became a deep adversary of Lenin and the Bolsheviks. He dies in late 1924 in Berlin. But that's not the last we'll hear of him. There's an interesting backstory here. At any rate, the Germans were rather hands-off with the Bolshevik program. They didn't make too many demands of the Bolsheviks. But there was one thing that they insisted on rather strongly, and it just so happened it coincided with the interests of the Bolsheviks themselves. This was that once the Bolsheviks were in power, they would publish the copies of the secret peace treaties that were located in the files of the Russian Foreign Office. And this is exactly what Trotsky, who is the foreign commissar, does shortly after the revolution. And indeed, this is a big embarrassment for the Allied powers. And it's one of the reasons for, when President Wilson issues the so-called 14 points, he tries to downplay these secret treaties. And the first point is, that any peace will be an open covenant of peace, openly arrived at. Of course, he breaks his word about that. But now we have to say here that Lenin has his own agenda. He's not doing this because the Germans are telling him to. Lenin is, he's neither a cipher nor is he a useful idiot. Put another way, he's neither a tool nor a fool. But he realizes that this will, what is Lenin's ultimate aim here is to stir up revolutionary upheaval, not just in Russia. Russia will be the beginning. Revolution will then spread to Germany, which everyone anticipated would be the home of a major revolutionary upheaval, and subsequently to Britain and to France, and who knows, maybe even the United States. The skies seem to be the limit at that point. Well, at any rate, the Germans are able to essentially corner the Bolsheviks, advancing deep into the territory of the Russian Empire, virtually unopposed. And Lenin and his colleagues are forced to sign a very punitive peace treaty at Brest-Litovsk in early 1918, in which Russia has to surrender large amounts of territory, including virtually the entirety of Poland, what we nowadays call the Baltic countries, Latvia, Estonia, and Lithuania, and rather important, virtually the entirety of Ukraine, which comes under the occupation of the Central Powers. And from that point on, Russia follows its own path of development with a good number of disappointments for the Bolsheviks. Now, it's 35 years later, in 1952, that our protagonist is born in what is now referred to as Leningrad, Vladimir Putin. And this is an interesting point. It's 35 years after the revolution of 1917. It's just a few months before the death of Joseph Stalin. And it's pretty much the exact halfway point of the entire history of the Soviet Union, which spans a little over 70 years between 1917 and the final collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991. A lot of water had flown under the bridge between 1917 and 1952. So let's consider the revolution itself, the imposition of terror by the Bolsheviks and by their opponents, it has to be said, in the civil war that followed, which claimed hundreds of thousands of victims, the enormous economic and financial damage, which left Russia a kind of shell of its pre-World War I self, the outbreak of famine, even in Ukraine, which was one of the most fertile parts of Russia, not just once, but several times in the early 1920s as a result of the Civil War, in the early 1930s, claiming millions of victims. The rise to power of Joseph Stalin, which few of the leading Bolsheviks foresaw in 1917. He kind of elbows aside the other leaders like Trotsky. Lenin is safely dead by this point. And Stalin carries out a rather ambitious program of collectivization of agriculture, which turns out to be a catastrophe for the Russian and other Soviet peasantry. And going along with that, a kind of crash program of industrialization, which is a wrenching experience and causes tremendous upheaval and quite a few victims inside Russia. An important element in all of this is the rise of the so-called Gulag. The Gulag system of prison camps, and one purpose of that is to provide a vast pool of forced labor in the industrialization drive, in particular the exploitation of raw materials in Siberia and other far-flung parts of the Soviet Union. Now, an important part of this Stalinization program is the use of the security services. And they go by a number of different names in the course of the Soviet experience. Under Lenin, initially they were referred to as the Cheka. And the Cheka, that comes from it's an acronym. It refers to the Extraordinary Commission for the struggle against counter-revolution and sabotage. It goes through a number of iterations thereafter before finally becoming the KGB after Stalin's death. But even in the late Cold War, members of the KGB often referred to themselves as Chekists. And the Chekists, whatever they might be called at any given moment, have a number of interesting elements to their identity. Now, there's this relationship that develops between the Cheka and organized crime. And most historians trace that back to the Gulag system, where essentially organized criminals ran the camps as opposed to the political prisoners, people who were imprisoned for holding dissident views. And in the later 1930s, those who had been purged from the Communist Party, who did not end up with bullets in the back of their head, but who were sent to the Gulag instead. So the criminal element was running these camps. And you have this rather interesting symbiotic relationship developing between that criminal element and the Chekists, so to speak. Now, I actually happen to think this relationship goes back even further, maybe as far as 1917 itself, because you couldn't trust the existing police forces. You had to get rid of them. And very, very often, the Bolsheviks recruited the Chekists from what the Marxists like to call the lumpen proletariat, the lowest orders of society, fading into the criminal element, so to speak, and well, I think it's a familiar story. At any rate, that too turns out is of some interest to our ongoing pattern that we'll be exploring here. So I'll conclude this by saying this: here we have our friend Putin being born in the aftermath of World War II, which is yet another wrenching experience for the Soviet Union, possibly the most catastrophic of all. A minimum of 20 to 25 million Soviet citizens were killed in the Second World War. In spite of the rhetoric of the alliance between the Soviet Union, the United States, and Great Britain in World War II, there's a great deal of mutual distrust on both sides. And that never entirely disappears from Soviet accounts of the Second World War. In fact, it's even intensified somewhat in later years, by the 1960s, 1970s, as it happens, a time when when our friend Vladimir is coming of age. But let's consider his background. I think it is crucial in understanding Putin's development, his formation, so to speak, to recognize three different factors. One is his identity as a native of Leningrad. And that shapes his entire worldview. It provides the circumstances in which he comes of age, which are frankly pretty grim. He's not born into a family of the elite or intellectuals or what have you. He's born into a working class family. His parents almost literally bear the scars of the Second World War on their bodies. So that first factor, the Leningrad identity. The second one is Putin's engagement with the study of German language and German history. And in fact, he spends 5 years in Germany at the very end of the Cold War from 1985 to 1990, which is of somewhat more importance than I think a lot of historians and political scientists have recognized. And the third element is his identity as an agent of the KGB, as a Chekist. And he's very much aware of the background to that. He's not just a KGB agent. He is an aficionado of the history of the KGB. So I'll leave off there. We'll continue with some of these. We'll pick up some of these threads at a somewhat later date. But let's just see who's paying attention. Oh, this won't be on the midterm. Anyway, thank you.